Protests in the United States have continued for the ninth straight night over race and police brutality. More than 30,000 National Guard troops have been activated in at least 31 states and Washington, D.C. as well. Protesters are calling for justice over the killing of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, in a brutal arrest by white police officers.
People are not saying anything new. We are saying the solutions that our ancestors told us. And so I'm here today to say the only solution to racial inequality is reparations.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
Demonstrations are now largely calm after violent unrest in the past week. But despite curfews in several states, scenes like these continue to take place. Thousands took to the streets holding Black Lives Matter signs and shining lights from their phones. But scuffles have broken out in some major cities. In New York, riot police have clubbed and arrested protesters defying the curfew. And at one point, an officer was stabbed and 2 others shot in Brooklyn. President Donald Trump is facing mounting criticism over his handling of the protests. Former Defense Secretary James Mattis is the latest to break his silence. In a surprising move, he says his former boss is trying to turn Americans against one another. Now, for more on this, Simon Marks joins us from Washington, D.C. He's been following developments across the country. Simon, new charges have now been handed down against all 4 officers involved in the George Floyd case. Has this appeased protesters in any way? It doesn't seem so.
Well, I think it's appeased some protesters to the extent that they were demanding tougher charges to be levied against Officer Derek Chauvin and demanding that the other police officers also in some fashion face justice. But it doesn't deal with the protesters' fundamental call, which is for a complete overhaul of the criminal justice system and for a total review of the way in which police in America's 50 disparate states, in towns and cities from coast to coast, handle the arrest of minority suspects and the treatment of minority suspects. So in and of itself, those additional charges don't take the sting out of a Black Lives Matter protest movement that has had an enormous amount of new impetus breathed into it as a result of the treatment of George Floyd on Monday a week ago. There's every indication that these protests are going to continue for several days to come. There are further potential flashpoints ahead, including, of course, George Floyd's funeral, which is going to be taking place next week. There are memorial services that are going to start taking place later today. So this has every potential to remain a big problem for towns and cities all over the country and for the Trump administration, with the White House now essentially walled off from downtown Washington, D.C., with that new security perimeter fence, which dramatically expands the perimeter around the White House. I mean, it really is Fortress White House at the moment in the center of Washington, D.C. As we came on the air, Steve, there was news of a mounting issue that President Trump is also having to contend with, and that is unemployment numbers. We've just had the latest Labor Department bulletin, and it shows that last week, another 1.8 million Americans claimed unemployment benefits for the first time. That takes the total number of unemployed in this country to more than 42 million. 42 million people with no jobs to go to at a time when many people are taking to America's streets suggests that these protests could definitely continue to grow in the days ahead.
Right, Simon, not forgetting there's also the COVID-19 looming around. But I want to talk about the elite military leaders. Some prominently former Defense Secretary James Mattis, they have denounced President Trump's response to the protests. This is quite unprecedented.
It is unprecedented, and it's certainly unprecedented in the life and times of General Jim Mattis, a man who has been under enormous pressure since he left Donald Trump's inner circle to tell the public what he thinks about the way in which President Trump governs the nation. And now he is absolutely not holding back. And remember that this statement was released just a matter of hours after the current Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, indicated that he was breaking with President Trump over this threat to deploy members of the armed services on the streets of American cities. Jim Mattis issued a statement saying, Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. James Mattis saying we are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. And that's coming from someone who was once considered one of the adults in Donald Trump's cabinet, a restraining influence around Donald Trump's table. The president, of course, has hit back on Twitter and dismissed the arguments that James Mattis is making, but they resonate with a large number of people here in Washington, D.C., including Republicans within the foreign policy community who have great respect for Jim Mattis and admired the work that he did as U.S. Defense Secretary. It's another political problem for the American president.
Indeed, strong words there, but thank you so much for that update. Summer Mark speaking to us from Washington, D.C.